March 1965, Ia Drang Valley, Central Highlands, Republic of Vietnam. A UH-1 Iroquois helicopter lifted off from Plei Me Special Forces Camp, carrying 8 soldiers and a crew of 2. It was not the last Huey to leave that morning. It was the only one that didn't come back. By the end of the Ia Drang campaign, the United States Army had lost 59 helicopters in 11 days. Most of them were Hueys, not to mechanical failure, to small arms, to .51 caliber heavy machine guns positioned at the precise altitude the aircraft had to fly to make its approach. The North Vietnamese Army had studied the landing zones before the first American boot touched the ground. They knew the Huey's approach angle. They knew its speed on short final. They knew exactly where to aim. The pilots knew it too. They flew anyway. What the Army never told the public was how many of them died in a cockpit they couldn't get out of. By 1963, the Bell UH-1 Iroquois had become the defining image of American military power in Southeast Asia. The Army called it the Iroquois. Everyone else called it the Huey, a corruption of its original designation HU-1 for helicopter utility. The name stuck faster than the aircraft could be modified. The Huey was not designed for combat. Bell helicopter engineers in Fort Worth built it as a utility platform, a medevac ship, a command courier, a logistical workhorse for a conventional European battlefield where the threat profile was entirely different. The transmission sat directly above the cockpit. The fuel cells were unarmored on early variants. The rotor blades, all aluminum construction, would shatter rather than deflect a .30 caliber round. The sliding cargo doors offered no ballistic protection whatsoever. In Vietnam, none of that mattered at first. The Army of the Republic of Vietnam was fighting a guerrilla insurgency with light weapons. The Huey flew into that environment and performed well, and the Army drew the wrong lesson. It extrapolated from success in low-threat conditions to mass deployment in high-threat conditions without fundamentally redesigning what it was deploying. By 1965, the United States had committed the 1st Cavalry Division, Airmobile, the first full division in American military history organized entirely around the helicopter. The doctrinal concept was air mobility. Use the helicopter's speed and flexibility to bypass terrain, strike the enemy before he could react, and withdraw before he could mass a counterattack. It worked against an enemy that couldn't adapt. The North Vietnamese Army adapted. The NVA's 33rd and 66th Regiments had spent months studying American helicopter operations before the Ia Drang battle. Captured documents later confirmed what the pilots had already noticed in their bones. The enemy knew the Huey's approach corridor. They knew its service ceiling under combat load. Effective hover-out-of-ground effect in the Central Highlands heat was far below its rated altitude. They knew the pilot had to commit to his approach at a certain point and could not break off without exposing his tail rotor. They placed their heavy machine guns accordingly. The pilots understood the geometry. They flew it anyway, because the men on the ground needed them to. The man who flew into that environment most mornings was 22 years old. He had been in country for 3 months. He had been flying helicopters for less than 2 years. He had been told the war would be over before his tour ended. He was wrong about that, too. The battle for Landing Zone X-ray began on November 14, 1965. Lieutenant Colonel Harold G. Moore's 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry, was outnumbered from the first lift. The landing zone could accommodate 8 Hueys simultaneously. Moore needed to put 450 men on the ground. The math meant the first elements would be on the ground, alone, unsupported, for an hour before the lifts could close. The Hueys flew in under fire from the second lift forward. Chief Warrant Officer Hank Ainsworth, piloting one of the assault ships into X-ray, later described the approach this way. The instruments looked right, the aircraft felt right, and then the windscreen had holes in it that hadn't been there before. There was no pause between normal flight and being shot at. You didn't hear it coming. You were fine, and then you weren't. The UH-1D variants used in the assault lifts had undergone minimal ballistic hardening. Armored seats for the pilots had been added in 1964. A quarter-inch of boron carbide plate. It stopped some fragments. It did not stop a 7.62 millimeter round from an AK-47 at close range. The aircraft's most exposed moment was the 30 seconds between final approach and touchdown. Airspeed below effective translational lift, altitude too low for autorotation to save the crew, committed to the zone. Pilots called that window the dead man's curve. The name was not informal. It was a formal term from the aircraft's flight envelope chart, a shaded region printed in the operator's manual where engine failure was not survivable. They flew through it 8 to 12 times a day on active air assaults. The crew chiefs and door gunners had no armored seats at all. They sat on the cargo floor or stood at the door guns on ammunition crates. Some units improvised, surplus body armor plates liberated from infantry units, placed flat on the floor to sit on. The logic was grim and practical. The rounds most likely to find you came from below, through the thin aluminum floor. Sitting on armor was better than wearing it. At Landing Zone Albany, 2 days after X-ray, the 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry walked into a column ambush and was torn apart in the elephant grass. Medevac Hueys flew into a zone that was still under fire because the wounded could not wait. Warrant Officer James Shadden landed his aircraft 4 times in an active kill zone before his Huey took a round through the engine and went down. He was pulled out by another crew. The men he'd extracted lived. His door gunner was shot through both legs while returning fire from the cargo door. He kept firing until the aircraft went down. This was a routine engagement by November 1965 standards. The structural problem was not pilot courage. There was never a shortage of that. The problem was physics. The Huey's two-bladed, semi-rigid rotor system produced a characteristic acoustic signature, the thwop-thwop, that became the sonic symbol of the entire war. And that same signature was audible to enemy observers on the ground well before the aircraft was visible. NVA anti-aircraft teams stationed along known approach corridors had time to acquire, track, and fire before the pilot could detect them. The aircraft announced itself before it arrived. By 1966, NVA units operating in the Central Highlands had developed a specific countermeasure. When a flight of Hueys was detected inbound, one heavy machine gun crew would hold fire completely while a second opened on the lead aircraft. The instinct of the flight, and the doctrine, was to suppress the gun that was firing. The gun that was silent waited until the formation committed to the zone, then opened on the aircraft at their most vulnerable point. After-action reports from the 1st Cavalry noted this pattern as early as March 1966. Doctrine was slow to respond. The gun crews were not. By 1967, the Army had fielded the UH-1C gunship variant, a dedicated attack helicopter with stub wings carrying rocket pods and M60 machine guns. It was supposed to protect the slicks, the unarmed troop carriers. The problem was performance. The UH-1C was underpowered by the same engine driving its heavier UH-1D counterpart. In the heat and altitude of the Central Highlands, loaded to combat weight, it could not keep pace with the aircraft it was meant to escort. Pilots of the C model described watching their slick charges pull away from them on final approach, into the dead man's curve, alone. The solution the Army fielded in the interim was the M60D machine gun mounted in the cargo doors, manned by the crew chief and door gunner. The M60D produced 550 rounds per minute and had an effective range of 1,100 meters in ideal conditions. In the door of a moving helicopter, making a 60-knot approach in ground turbulence, engaging a muzzle flash glimpsed for under a second in dense vegetation at tree level, it was a suppression weapon at best. It told the enemy there was a gun. It rarely convinced him to stop. The most dangerous mission profile in the Huey was not the combat assault. It was the medevac. Dust-off crews, the Army's medical evacuation helicopter units, flew under the Geneva Convention's Red Cross markings. In theory, those markings granted protected status. In practice, NVA and Viet Cong units used the Red Cross as an aiming reference. It was large. It was painted on the nose, on both sides of the fuselage, and on the belly. It was visible from a considerable distance. Dust-off crews were required by doctrine to respond to any request, regardless of zone conditions. The phrase, "zone is hot" in a medevac request meant the enemy was actively firing at the position. The dust-off crew was expected to come in anyway. Major Charles Kelly, the commanding officer of the 57th Medical Detachment, established the culture that defined dust-off operations for the rest of the war. When ground units asked whether he could land in an active fire zone, his answer was that if they needed him, he'd come. On July 1, 1964, he was killed bringing his Huey into a hot zone in Bong Son Province. He was posthumously awarded the Distinguished Service Cross. His crews continued flying to hot zones because Kelly had made it the standard, and the standard did not die with him. The culture he built was institutionally indistinguishable from a standing order to accept suicidal risk. The crews accepted it every day. Captain Ed Freeman flew his Huey into landing zone X-ray 14 times on November 14, 1965, after the zone was officially declared too hot for medevac operations. His aircraft had no medical markings and no wounded evacuation designation. He had heard the ground commander request medevac support and receive a denial. He made the decision without orders. He flew 14 lifts into a zone under continuous fire, extracting wounded soldiers and delivering ammunition for 4 hours. His aircraft was hit multiple times on every lift. He returned to the zone anyway. He received the Medal of Honor 36 years later, in 2001, after a decades-long effort by survivors to have the mission recognized. The Army's official records of the day logged the medevac missions flown by designated dust-off crews. Freeman's 14 lifts were not in those records. They were in the memories of the men he pulled out. The aircraft itself continued to improve incrementally. The UH-1H, fielded broadly by 1967, carried a more powerful Lycoming T-53 L-13B engine that partially restored performance margins lost to tropical heat and altitude. Armored fuel cells reduced fire risk on later variants. Crews devised their own modifications: steel plate bolted across the cargo floor, sandbags wired to the troop seats, discarded infantry flak jackets strapped across the nose bubble. None of it was in the technical manual. All of it came from men who had watched what happened when it wasn't there. None of it solved the dead man's curve, Captain Robert Mason flew 1,000 combat assaults in the Huey before he stopped counting. In his memoir, he described the calculation a pilot eventually had to make about his own survival odds. And the moment he stopped making it, not because the math had improved, but because he had understood that the math was beside the point. The mission existed. The men on the ground existed. The aircraft existed. You flew it. The North Vietnamese Army never fully solved the Huey either. They shot down thousands of them and never stopped the missions. Every time a zone was declared too hot and the slicks held off, a crew chief somewhere in the flight decided that too hot was a logistical problem, not a final answer. The aircraft was vulnerable, slow, loud, and impossible to surprise anyone with. The crews flew it into the worst terrain on Earth, into positions the enemy had pre-registered their weapons on, at altitudes the enemy had calibrated to, and they did it again the next morning. The war produced no weapon that was feared, the way the AC-47 was feared, no weapon that broke ambushes, the way the Quad 50 broke them. The Huey did not inspire fear in the enemy. It inspired something harder to name, the grinding daily recognition that no matter how many they shot down, more would come. The NVA could kill a Huey crew. They could not make the next crew stay on the ground. Between 1961 and 1975, the United States lost 5,086 helicopters in Southeast Asia. Of those, 2,591 were attributed to hostile fire. The majority were UH-1 variants. The total aviation community death toll, pilots, crew chiefs, door gunners, and medical personnel, exceeded 2,100 killed in action, with thousands more wounded. Against those numbers, the mission totals: 9.7 million combat sorties flown by Army aviation in Vietnam, 900,000 wounded soldiers evacuated from the battlefield, a 97% survival rate for any soldier who reached a hospital alive, compared to 71% in the Second World War. The aircraft that absorbed the loss rate made the survival rate possible. The Army's internal after-action analysis, classified for decades, concluded that the UH-1 had been deployed in a threat environment beyond its design parameters without sufficient ballistic hardening, and that loss rates in the 1965 to 1967 period exceeded acceptable thresholds. The analysis recommended accelerated development of a purpose-built attack helicopter with armored crew stations and a weapon system capable of suppressing crew-served anti-aircraft weapons. That aircraft, the AH-1 Cobra, entered Vietnam service in 1967. The Cobra did not replace the Huey. Nothing replaced the Huey. The Slick kept flying medevac and assault missions until the last American helicopter left Saigon in April 1975. The NVA had never found a way to make that stop. There are approximately 7,000 UH-1 airframes still flying worldwide. Several hundred operate in the United States, firefighting agencies, local governments, private owners. You can hear one from a quarter-mile away. The two-bladed, semi-rigid rotor produces a specific acoustic frequency at 324 revolutions per minute that is unlike any other aircraft in service. Vietnam veterans have reported a startled response to the sound 40 years after their last flight. Not a memory, a reflex. The Army Aviation Museum at Fort Rucker, Alabama, maintains a full collection of Vietnam-era variants. Each aircraft has a plaque. Most do not list the crew by name. A museum curator, asked why, said the names would take more wall space than the exhibit had. Captain Ed Freeman received his Medal of Honor in a White House ceremony in 2001. He was 70 years old. Several of the men he had pulled out of Landing Zone X-ray were in the room. One of them had been 19 years old when Freeman's Huey came in on the 14th lift, with the zone on fire and medevac officially suspended. He said he had heard the sound of the rotor before he saw the aircraft. He said it was the best sound he ever heard in his life. 5,086 helicopters, 2,591 shot down by the enemy. The Army called the program a success. The crews called it the Dead Man's Curve, and flew through it anyway, every morning, because the alternative was leaving someone on the ground. The Huey was not built to survive Vietnam. It did it 9.7 million times.